If you could step into a time machine and open the door of a house in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago, the first shock wouldn't be what you see, it would be what you feel. The floor beneath your feet isn't smooth. It is an uneven surface of beaten earth, compacted by generations of footsteps, hard as concrete but grainy like fine sand. The air is thick. It is a mixture of smoke from burning dung, animal fat melting over hot stone, and something sweet you can't quite identify. It is the smell of roasted wheat with honey, the breakfast of those who lived there. And then the darkness. Even at noon, with the sun blazing outside, the interior of this house is almost nocturnal. One or two tiny openings in the wall. They aren't windows as we know them, but slits less than a foot wide, let in only thin beams of light that cut through the gloom like blades. This house is unlike anything you have ever inhabited. It has no internal partitions, no hallway, no bathroom, and no separate kitchen. And here is the detail that will surprise you more than any other in this video. The entire family, father, mother, children, grandparents, slept, cooked, ate, and worked in a single room of less than 400 square feet, smaller than a modern apartment living room. And they were not alone in this space. They shared the same roof with their animals, goats, sheep, sometimes a donkey, everyone breathing the same air every night. How is it possible that millions of people lived like this for millennia? And more importantly, what does this space reveal to us about the real lives of the people who inhabit the pages of the Bible? To understand a biblical house, you need to forget everything you know about modern construction. Forget industrial bricks, forget cement, forget glass. The materials that raised these walls came literally from the ground the builders walked on. Raw stone gathered from the surrounding fields, not cut, not polished, just carefully stacked and fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. In the gaps between the stones, a mortar made of clay mixed with chopped straw and, in some cases, animal dung. This mixture was packed into the gaps and smoothed by hand, literally by hand, with fingers. Excavations at Tel Arad in the Negev region have revealed walls where the fingerprints of the builders are still imprinted in the clay after 3,000 years. You are looking at the fingerprint of someone who lived in the time of King David. The walls were, on average, 2 feet thick. And this wasn't overkill, it was survival engineering. Thick walls of stone and mud act as natural thermal insulation. During the day, when the desert sun pushes the outside temperature past 100 degrees, these walls absorb the heat slowly, keeping the interior cool. At night, when the desert cools drastically, sometimes dropping 40 degrees in just a few hours, the walls release the stored heat, warming the interior. It is a passive climate control system so efficient that modern architecture only rediscovered this principle in the last 50 years under the name thermal mass. 3 millennia ago, an illiterate shepherd in Judah already knew this. Not because he was an engineer, but because his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather built this way, and whoever built differently did not survive the first summer. But here enters something that no one shows you in children's Bible illustrations: the roof. The roof of a biblical house wasn't just a covering. It was the most important room in the house. And most people don't even know it existed as a usable space. The roof was flat, completely flat. It had no slope and no ceramic tiles like later Roman houses. It was a structure made of wooden beams, sycamore or cypress, depending on the region, placed side by side atop the walls. Over the beams, a layer of interwoven branches and brushwood. Over the branches, a thick layer of mud mixed with lime, compacted with a cylindrical stone roller that every family owned. This roller stayed permanently on the roof. And do you know why? Because after every rain, the homeowner would go up and run the roller over the entire surface to recompact the mud and seal the cracks before water could seep in. If he didn't do this within 24 hours after the rain, the roof would start to leak, the mud would soften, and in extreme cases, the entire ceiling could collapse. Proverbs compares a quarrelsome wife to a continual dripping on a rainy day. And now you understand that this wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It was a real domestic catastrophe. A leaking roof meant mold, dampness, disease, and potentially the collapse of the entire structure onto the family while they slept. And that flat roof was where life really happened. Think about it. The interior of the house was dark, stuffy, and crowded with people and animals. The roof was where fruits and grains were dried in the sun, where flax was laid out to bleach, where women spun wool in the cool evening breeze. It was where the family gathered to eat on summer nights, when the residual heat inside made it impossible to sleep indoors. It was where guests were accommodated when there was no room below. Remember the story of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. When the Israelite spies arrived in Jericho, she hid them on the roof, under the stalks of flax that were spread out there to dry. This wasn't improvisation. The roof was such a normal, everyday space that hiding two men under bundles of flax up there was like hiding someone in a backyard tool shed. No one would think to look there first because it was a completely routine setting. And there is more. In 2 Samuel 11:2, when David spots Bathsheba bathing, he is on the palace roof. And where is she? In the courtyard or on the roof of her house? Both are on the roof, because that was where people lived when they wanted fresh air, relative privacy, and natural light. The roof was so essential that Mosaic law required by law, that every roof have a parapet around it. Deuteronomy 22:8 says textually, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring blood guilt upon your house if anyone should fall from it." Civil construction regulation, building code, more than 3,000 years ago. And if someone fell from your roof without a parapet, the legal blame lay with the homeowner. This is a level of social organization that most people do not associate with the biblical world. If this level of detail has already impressed you, leave a like now, because what comes next is even more surprising. Let's go down from the roof and enter through the door. The first thing you need to know is, the door was low, very low. Most entrances found in archaeological excavations of Israelite houses are between 4 and 5 feet tall. Any average adult had to stoop to enter. This wasn't carelessness, it was protection. A low door forced any intruder to enter bent over in a vulnerable position, easy to strike on the head or back. In times of conflict, and times were almost always times of conflict, your front door was your first line of defense. The door itself was made of thick wooden planks joined with crossbars and pivoted on stone sockets set into the floor and the upper lintel. There were no metal hinges. Metal was too rare and expensive for domestic use in ordinary homes. The stone pivots functioned like a primitive ball bearing, and over time, the friction created deep grooves in the stone of the threshold. Archaeologists can estimate how long a house was occupied by the depth of the groove, the door pivot carved into the rock. In some houses in Megiddo, these grooves are over an inch deep. Decades, perhaps centuries of doors opening and closing over the same stone. Now you have crossed the door, and you are inside. Your eyes take a few seconds to adjust to the gloom. What do you see first? The floor drops. It isn't flat. The interior of a typical Israelite house, especially in the period from 1200 to 600 BC, covering from the Judges to the Babylonian exile, was divided into two connected levels. The lower level, right at the entrance, sat about 1.5 feet below the rest of the house. And this sunken space had a function that shocks any modern person. It was where the animals stayed during the night. Goats, sheep, a pack donkey. They entered through the same door as the family and went down to this lower level. The raised part, on the opposite half of the house, is where the family lived. They slept, cooked, ate, and worked all up there. And the reason for this level division was brilliant. The animal's body heat rose naturally, warming the space where the people slept during cold nights. The house was designed to function as an integrated system where animals and humans mutually benefited. The animals were protected from predators and the cold, and the people gained free heating during the freezing nights of the Judean hill country, where temperatures can drop to freezing in the winter. But think about the concrete reality of this. The sound of goats chewing dry grass in the dark while you try to sleep. The constant smell of fresh manure less than 6 feet from your head. The risk of a sick animal transmitting parasites to a child sleeping on the level above. This coexistence was so intimate that organic remains found on the lower floors of excavated houses in Hazer and Beersheba contain stratified layers of animal dung, cooking ash, and domestic pottery fragments, all mixed together. Physical evidence that the separation between human space and animal space was more conceptual than real. And now you need to know the most common floor plan of an Israelite house, because it appears in dozens of archaeological sites from northern to southern Israel, and it is so consistent that archaeologists gave it a technical name, the four-room house. In Hebrew, Beit Arba HaMerhavim. Despite the name, it didn't always have 4 separate rooms. The name refers to the layout in the shape of a U around a central courtyard. Imagine it like this. You enter through the door and you are in the central courtyard, an open or partially covered space that functions as the heart of the home. From the courtyard, 2 side aisles branch out, one on each side, usually narrower, separated by stone pillars or rows of rudimentary columns. At the back, closing the U, is a wide room that was the main living space. The side aisles could serve as a stable, storehouse, or workshop. The back space was where the family slept. And the central courtyard was where everything else happened: cooking, grinding grain, preparing food, weaving, making pottery. This floor plan has appeared in excavations at Tel Beit Mirsim, Tel Massos, Ai, Radana, Beersheba, Hazor, Tirzah. Dozens of different sites spread throughout the land of Israel, covering a period of more than 600 years. The uniformity is striking. A peasant in northern Galilee and a shepherd in the Negev desert built their houses with the same basic plan. This doesn't happen by coincidence. It happens because this plan was a perfect solution for the exact needs of that society. An agricultural family that needed space for animals, crop storage, artisanal production, and domestic life, all within a single compact and inexpensive structure to build. And here is a fact that fascinated the first archaeologists who excavated these houses. The 4-room house plan appears almost exclusively in Israelite settlements. In Philistine sites from the same era, just a few miles away, the houses have completely different plans, Aegean influence, with large central halls and benches along the walls. In Canaanite sites, another configuration. The 4-room house became what archaeologists call an ethnic marker, a way to identify, just by the house plan, whether the inhabitants were Israelites or not. Your house was your identity. Now let's go to the busiest place in the house, the central courtyard. If the roof was the second floor, the courtyard was the industrial kitchen, the laundry, the workshop, and the social area combined into a space of perhaps 150 square feet. In the center, or near one of the courtyard walls, stood the oven, the tabun. And the tabun was so central to domestic life that losing the tabun was almost like losing the entire house. It was a conical structure made of clay, about 2 feet high and 16 inches in diameter, looking like a giant ceramic pot turned upside down. At the base, an opening to feed the fire. At the top, the heated surface where bread was baked directly against the glowing inner clay wall. The most common fuel wasn't wood. Wood was too scarce in most regions of Israel. It was dried animal dung. Women collected fresh manure, mixed it with straw, shaped it into flat discs, and dried them in the sun on the roof. These dried dung discs burned slowly, produced constant embers, and generated a uniform heat perfect for baking bread. Ezekiel makes a direct reference to this. God commands the prophet to bake bread using human dung as fuel, and Ezekiel is so horrified that he begs to at least use cow dung. This verse makes zero sense to a modern reader. To an ancient Israelite, the message was crystal clear. Using human dung instead of animal dung meant ritual contamination, impurity, and absolute humiliation. The difference between cow dung and human dung wasn't just hygienic, it was theological. And there, next to the tabun, were the tools that defined the daily life of an Israelite woman. And when I say defined, I mean she spent between 2 and 3 hours a day on just one task: grinding grain. The handmill, called in Hebrew rechaim, consisted of 2 circular stones, a lower, fixed, slightly concave one, and an upper one that the woman turned by hand using a wooden handle. Grains of wheat or barley were poured through the central hole of the upper stone, and as she turned it, they were crushed between the 2 surfaces until they became flour that flowed out the edges. This sound, the rhythmic friction of stone against stone, like a low and continuous groan, was so characteristic of an inhabited house that Jeremiah uses its absence as a symbol of total destruction. I will banish from them the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. When the millstones stop turning, the house is dead. There is no more family, no more bread, no more life inside, and the physical wear was brutal. Analysis of female skeletons found in sites like Tel Arad shows severe deformations in the knees, back, and wrists, premature arthritis, thickened bones at the joints, and cartilage wear. 30-year-old women presented the joints of 60-year-old women by modern standards. Grinding grain literally consumed the body, and it was inescapable. Without grinding, there was no flour. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no survival. If you believe these real-life details in the Bible need to be better known, comment, "I didn't know." But the central courtyard wasn't just hard work. It was where stories were told. It's where the mother taught her daughters to weave, the eldest daughter cared for the little ones, and neighbors dropped by to exchange news, borrow a bit of leaven, or simply escape loneliness. Houses were built so close to one another, sometimes sharing walls, that one family's courtyard was less than 10 feet from the neighbor's courtyard. Privacy, as we know it, did not exist. You heard every conversation, every fight, every laugh, every baby's cry from the house next door. Proverbs again makes reference to this. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. It wasn't sentimentality, it was architectural reality. Your neighbor was literally closer to you than any relative living in another village. Now let's go up from the courtyard to the raised part, the space where the family slept, ate, and received visitors. And here we come to one of the hardest details for the modern mind to accept. There was no furniture. Almost none. A common Israelite family did not own tables, did not own chairs, did not own beds with wooden frames. These were luxuries of kings and the urban elite. The prophet Amos, in Amos 6:4, condemns the rich of Samaria who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches. And the condemnation only makes sense if you understand that the overwhelming majority of the people had none of that. The common family slept on mats of woven straw spread directly on the beaten earth floor. On cold nights, they covered themselves with their own cloaks. The thick wool cape they wore during the day was their blanket at night. Exodus 22:26-27 legislates on this. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? Taking someone's cloak as debt collateral was legal, but returning it before nightfall was mandatory, because without it the person literally had nothing to cover themselves with to sleep. Mosaic law had social conscience built into the smallest details. And meals? No table. The family sat on the floor around a mat or animal skin where food was placed in shared ceramic bowls. Everyone ate from the same dish, with their hands using pieces of flatbread as a spoon. When Jesus, in the Gospel of John, dips the bread and gives it to Judas at the Last Supper, it is exactly this dynamic. A shared central bowl, bread as a tool, total physical intimacy among those who ate together. Eating with someone was an act of trust. Betraying someone with whom you broke bread was the deepest violation that existed in the culture. Now look at the walls around you. Are they bare? Not completely. In the simplest houses, the internal walls received a layer of lime plaster, a white coating that served two functions, reflecting the little light that came through the slits, minimally brightening the interior, and acting as a natural antiseptic. Lime has antibacterial properties, and plastering with lime was the ancient way of sterilizing a surface. Leviticus 14:43-45 describes a procedure where, if mold or plague appeared on the walls of a house, the contaminated stones had to be removed, the plaster scraped off, and new stones and new plaster applied. If the plague returned, the entire house had to be demolished and the materials taken outside the city to an unclean place. This is quarantine applied to buildings, a sanitary protocol from 3,500 years ago. But here is what will completely change your view of these spaces. Inside these whitewashed walls, practically windowless, illuminated only by one or two oil lamps, small ceramic bowls with a flax wick soaked in olive oil. Inside this space that to us would seem like a cramped and suffocating cave, an entire family did not just survive. They lived fully. Births happened there, directly on that earthen floor. Deaths happened there, and the body was mourned in the same space where hours before someone had needed bread. Weddings were celebrated there, with the courtyard and the roof serving as the banquet hall. Prayers were said there, with the father of the family reciting the scriptures from memory because there was no accessible written copy. The Torah existed in scrolls kept in the synagogue, not in private homes. Every inch of that space had memory. The pillar where the grandmother leaned in her final years, the corner of the courtyard where the eldest son shaped his first ceramic pot, the dark mark on the wall of the tabun where the fire burned for decades. A biblical house was not an address. It was a living organism that breathed along with the family that inhabited it. And here enters something that no one tells you about these houses, something that completely changes how we read dozens of biblical passages. The question of light, or rather the almost absolute lack of it. A common oil lamp, and excavations have recovered thousands of them throughout the region, produces the equivalent of about one modern candle. One. Now imagine 400 square feet of interior space illuminated by one or two of these lamps. Most of the house remained in permanent shadow. You could see the face of whoever was sitting directly next to the flame, but the rest of the room was a play of shadows and silhouettes, and the olive oil used as fuel was not cheap. For a poor family, keeping a lamp burning all night was a significant cost. Proverbs praises the virtuous woman by saying her lamp does not go out at night, and now you understand that this wasn't just a compliment to her diligence, it was a sign of prosperity. A woman who could afford to keep the house lit throughout the night was a woman whose family was in good financial standing. And when Jesus tells the parable of the woman who loses a coin and sweeps the whole house looking for it, Luke 15:8, the tension of the scene is much greater than it seems in a casual reading. She lights a lamp and sweeps the beaten earth floor in a dark, cramped space, full of corners and shadows, where a small coin could have rolled into a crack between stones or buried itself in the loose earth. Finding a coin under these conditions was genuinely difficult. The parable doesn't work if you imagine a modern house with tile floors and electric light. It only makes sense when you are in there, on your knees in the dark, scraping the floor with your fingers, while the weak flame of the lamp flickers with your every move. But darkness wasn't the only challenge of living in these spaces. What happened when it rained, really rained, will make you look at the roof in a different way. Because the roof, we described earlier, that surface of compacted earth over branches and beams, had a mortal enemy, the winter rain. And when we say rain in Israel, we aren't talking about a light drizzle. The rainy season, from October to March, brought violent storms that dumped most of the annual precipitation in just a few months. In Jerusalem, the annual average is about 22 inches, comparable to London. But while London distributes this rain uniformly throughout the year, Jerusalem concentrates almost everything in 4 or 5 months. When it rained, it really rained. And the beaten earth roof was not waterproof. It was resistant, but not waterproof. After hours of continuous rain, water would begin to seep in. First a dark spot on the ceiling, then a drop, then a constant stream falling in the middle of the room. And if the homeowner hadn't done proper maintenance before the rainy season, running the stone roller to recompact the surface, adding a new layer of clay mixed with lime, the roof could turn into a sieve. Proverbs says that a continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. And Proverbs repeats the image almost word for word. A continual dripping on a day of steady rain and a contentious woman are alike. This repetition is not accidental. The dripping of the roof was a torture so well known, so universally experienced, that it became the most intuitive metaphor for constant and inescapable irritation. Every listener knew exactly what it meant. You are lying on your mat, trying to sleep, and that drop falls, and falls again, and falls again. There is no way to fix it in the middle of the storm. There is no way to escape in a 400 square foot space. You simply endure it until the rain stops. But the problem went beyond discomfort. A roof that was not properly maintained could collapse. The soaked earth became exponentially heavier. The wooden beams supporting the structure began to sag under the extra weight. And in extreme cases, the entire roof collapsed on whoever was inside. Archaeological records of houses in Tel Beit Mirsim show evidence of collapsed roofs. Layers of earth and beams found over the floors of the rooms, covering domestic objects that were in use at the moment collapse. In at least 2 cases, excavators found intact pottery under the roof rubble, as if the family had just left or hadn't managed to get out. And that is why roof maintenance was not optional. It was a legal obligation. Deuteronomy 22:8 explicitly commands, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. You may not bring blood guilt upon your house if anyone should fall from it." The law required a parapet because people lived on the roof. If someone fell and died, the responsibility lay with the owner. The house was not just private property, it was a moral responsibility. The law did not separate architecture from ethics. Building poorly was a sin. And here we enter an aspect that completely transforms the reading of entire biblical stories: storage. Because if you live in a society without refrigeration, without supermarkets, without any way to buy food outside of the harvest season, then the difference between a family that stores well and one that stores poorly is the difference between surviving the winter or not. The side aisles of the 4-room house, those narrow spaces branching off the central courtyard, frequently functioned as a pantry. And what we find in these spaces in excavations is revealing. Rows of storage jars, called in Hebrew pithoi, large ceramic vessels about 2 to 3 feet high, with a wide mouth and a pointed or rounded base. Each could hold between 10 and 15 gallons of dry grains: wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas. A family needed multiple such jars to get through the year. In excavations of houses at Tel Beit Shemesh, Archaeologists found alignments of up to 8 pithoi in a single side aisle, all positioned upright against the wall. It is estimated that the total contents stored enough cereal to feed a family of 7 to 8 people for about 6 months. This meant that the harvest of a single year, concentrated in a few weeks of frantic work between April and June, determined whether your family would eat or go hungry for the next 12 months. There was no margin for error. A hailstorm at the wrong time, a plague of locusts, an illness that prevented the father from working during the harvest. Any of these things could mean real famine. And the problem wasn't just producing and storing enough food. It was keeping that food viable for months in hot climate without any modern preservation technology. Grains had to be completely dry before being stored. Otherwise, they would develop fungi and become toxic. The mouth of the jars was sealed with ceramic lids or with layers of wet clay that, upon drying, created a seal. But rodents were a constant threat. Rats and mice gnawed the ropes that held the lids and contaminated the contents. The lower floors of many houses revealed cat bones in association with storage areas, suggesting that cats were tolerated, perhaps even encouraged, as biological pest control. Not as pets, as employees. And it wasn't just grains. Olive oil, which served as fuel for lamps, as a cooking base, as a medicinal product, as a skin moisturizer, and as a component of religious rituals, was stored in smaller jars with narrower mouths to minimize exposure to air. Wine, which unlike water did not carry the parasites that caused dysentery and other diseases, was kept in jars sealed with pine resin. The resin wasn't just for sealing. It had antimicrobial properties that helped preserve the wine for longer. When archaeologists analyze chemical residues inside ancient jars, they can identify exactly what each contained. Fatty acids from olive oil, tartaric acid from wine, protein remains of curdled milk. Each jar was a chemical time capsule. And now let's talk about something that no modern person would think to ask, but which dominated practical life inside these houses every day: water. Where did it come from? How was it stored? And why does this simple question explain some of the greatest crises and miracles in the Bible? A typical Israelite house did not have its own well. Water came from one of 3 sources: natural springs, cisterns carved into the rock, or community wells. In the villages of the hill country, where most of the Israelite population lived, cisterns were the most common solution. They were cavities dug into the limestone rock, lined with a layer of waterproof plaster made of lime and ash, which collected and stored rainwater. An average domestic cistern had the capacity to store between 5 and 10,000 gallons of water. It seems like a lot, but for a family with animals, during a dry season that lasted from May to October, 5 to 6 months without a drop of rain, every gallon was counted. And the quality of this water? It degraded over the months. Stagnant water in a cistern developed algae, insect larvae, and bacteria. The water from the last months of the dry season was cloudy, tasted strange, and frequently caused intestinal problems. Jeremiah uses exactly this image when God accuses Israel of having abandoned him. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. The metaphor is devastating when you understand the reality. A spring of living waters, fresh, flowing, clean, inexhaustible, versus a cistern, stagnant, standing water that can leak and leave you with nothing in the height of summer. Israel's spiritual choice was being compared to the worst practical decision a builder could make. And the task of fetching water, and here we enter one of those details that reveal the entire social structure, was almost exclusively female. Women and the eldest daughters went to the spring or the community cistern with ceramic jars on their heads, walking distances that could reach half a mile or more, 2 or 3 times a day. Each jar carried between 3 and 4 gallons. Do the math. 30 pounds of weight, balanced on the head with no handle, no support, on irregular stone paths, going up and down hills. When Genesis 24 tells the story of Abraham's servant who goes to find a wife for Isaac and meets Rebekah at the spring, the text says that she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. And then she offers water to the servant's 10 camels. A dehydrated camel can drink up to 25 gallons of water at once. 10 camels, potentially 250 gallons. Rebekah wasn't making a symbolic gesture of kindness. She was offering herself for a monumental physical labor, dozens of trips to the spring with a 4-gallon jar, going up and down, jar after jar, until all the camels had drunk. The servant wasn't impressed by her delicacy. He was impressed by her strength, her readiness for hard work, and her radical generosity. That was a woman who would build a family and survive in that brutal world. And this is where we need to talk about the people who lived inside these walls, because until now we have described the house as a physical structure, but a biblical house was not inhabited by a nuclear family as we understand it today. It was inhabited by what anthropologists call the patrilocal extended family, the Beit Av, literally the father's house. The Beit Av included the patriarch, the oldest father or grandfather, his wife, his married sons with their respective wives and children, and sometimes servants or attached workers. In a 4-room house of average size, between 400 and 600 square feet, 10, 12, even 15 people could live. Without separate bedrooms, without internal doors, without privacy of any kind. And when a son got married, he didn't leave home. He brought his wife inside. The new wife entered the husband's family home and began living under the authority of her mother-in-law, who controlled the domestic space. The tensions this generated are evident in the Bible itself. The story of Ruth is, in part, the story of a woman who chose to follow her mother-in-law instead of returning to her own family's house, a decision so counterintuitive in the context of the time that the narrative highlights it as extraordinary. And Micah 7:6 says, in a context of social denunciation, "For the son treats the father with contempt, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house." The mother-in-law/daughter-in-law tension wasn't just a social phenomenon. It was a direct consequence of architecture. 2 adult women competing for authority over the same courtyard, the same tabun, the same workspace day after day, with no possibility of physical separation. And the children. In a house where 10 or more people slept, where animals occupied the lower level, where the tabun burned with constant fire in the courtyard, where stone and ceramic tools were everywhere, childhood was radically different from what we imagine. Infant mortality was devastating. Demographic studies based on cemeteries excavated in sites like Tel Arad and Lachish suggest that between 30 and 50% of children died before the age of 5. Gastrointestinal diseases caused by contaminated water, respiratory infections aggravated by constant smoke inside houses without proper ventilation, domestic accidents, malnutrition during years of bad harvests. This means that in a family that had 6 or 7 children over the mother's reproductive life, which was common, 3 or 4 would not reach adulthood. The pain of this loss does not appear directly in biblical texts often, but it is there, woven between the lines. When Psalm 127 says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth," the military metaphor is not poetic exaggeration. Children were literally the defense of the family. Each child who survived to working age, around 7 or 8 years old, was another pair of arms in the harvest, another person to fetch water, another guarantee that the parents would be cared for in old age. Losing a child was not just an emotional tragedy, it was a threat to the economic survival of the entire family. And here we touch on a point that connects everything we've seen so far, the house, the animals, the storage, the water, the family, and which explains why the biblical house was much more than a construction of stone and mud. It was a complete economic unit, a miniature factory. Everything the family consumed was produced there or in the fields immediately surrounding it. The women spun and wove all the family's clothing. The wool shorn from the sheep that slept downstairs was cleaned, carded, spun on a hand spindle, and then woven on a vertical loom leaning against the courtyard wall. Loom weights, small donut-shaped clay objects, are one of the most common finds in excavations of Israelite houses. Every house had its loom, every woman knew how to weave, and the clothing for every family member was produced right there, in that courtyard, thread by thread. Pottery, bowls for eating, jars for storage, lamps for light, was in many cases produced domestically too, although from the monarchy period onward, production became more specialized and commercial. Food was processed at all stages. Grains ground into flour, olives pressed into oil using small domestic presses carved into the rock, grapes trodden in vats to produce wine. Every step happened within the domestic complex. There was no separation between home and work. There was no separation between domestic life and economic life. The house was the economy. And that is why losing the house due to debt, military conquest, or natural disaster was an absolute catastrophe. You didn't just lose the place where you slept. You lost your means of production, your food supply, your tools, your loom, your animals, your seeds for the next planting. You lost everything. When the prophets denounce the rich who join house to house, Isaiah 5:8, the accusation is not about real estate accumulation in the modern sense. It is about destroying entire families by taking the production units, condemning them to total misery and dependency. And now, with all this in your mind, the darkness, the smell, the animals, the sound of the millstones, the smoke from the tabun, the jars of grain against the wall, the entire family compressed in this space without internal doors. Now you are prepared to understand something that changes the entire Bible. Every domestic scene you read in the scriptures happens here, inside this. When Hannah prays in silence and Eli thinks she is drunk, she likely returned to a house exactly like this. When the Shunammite woman prepares a room on the roof for the prophet Elisha, a separate room with a bed, table, chair, and lamp, the text specifies each piece of furniture because having any furniture was already exceptional. She wasn't simply being hospitable, she was offering luxury. When David hides from Saul's men, the spaces where he takes refuge are these: narrow, dark, full of blind corners where light does not reach. When the woman of Proverbs 31 wakes up before dawn to prepare food for the family, she is rising from that earthen floor, lighting that weak lamp, and walking to that tabun in the dark courtyard to begin a day that will not end until the last lamp goes out. And when Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many rooms," John 14:2, he is speaking to people who knew only this type of house, people who never had a room to themselves, people who slept, squeezed between siblings and cousins on the earthen floor of a windowless space. To these people, the promise of a room of their own in the Father's house was not a theological abstraction. It was the greatest luxury imaginable. And that is exactly why we need to talk about the night. Because everything we have described so far, the work, the storage, the cooking, the grinding, the loom, all of this happened while there was natural light. When the sun set, the biblical house transformed into a completely different place. And most people have never stopped to think about what that meant. Today, you flip a switch, light appears, instant uniform white clean. You get up in the middle of the night and walk through your house without a second thought. You open the refrigerator, the light turns on by itself. You go to the bathroom, you turn on another light. Your brain doesn't even register it anymore. Darkness, for us, is a choice. You close the curtain when you want darkness. It does not impose itself. Now turn everything off, everything. Turn off every bulb, every LED, every cell phone screen, cover every crack in the window, and light a single wick soaked in olive oil inside a ceramic container the size of your palm. That is all you have. That is the world after sunset in an Israelite house. The ceramic lamps, called in Hebrew ner, were small, simple, and produced an amount of light that would surprise any modern person by its weakness. Experimental archaeology tests conducted by researchers at the University of Haifa measured the luminosity of replica lamps from the Iron Age. The result? Between 1 and 3 lux. To put it in perspective, 1 lux is approximately equal to the light of a candle 3 feet away. A modern lit living room has between 300 and 500 lux. In other words, the lamp illuminated a useful area of no more than 5 feet around it. Beyond that circle, total darkness, and each family had, at best, 2 or 3 lamps working at the same time, which meant that most of the house, those corners, those side aisles where the storage jars were kept, the animal space on the lower floor, was pure darkness, darkness so thick you couldn't see your own hand. And there was a cost. The oil that fed the lamp was the same oil used for cooking, for medicine, for moisturizing the skin, for religious rituals. Every hour of light consumed oil that could have fed the family. Keeping a lamp burning all night was not a matter of comfort. It was an economic calculation, and yet most families kept at least 1 lamp lit throughout the night. Why? Because total darkness meant being unable to attend to a sick child, being unable to find the exit if there were a fire, being unable to see a scorpion walking toward the body of someone sleeping on the floor. And scorpions were not a hypothetical concern. Yellow scorpions of the Leiurus genus, native to the region, are nocturnal. They come out to hunt when the temperature drops. In houses with beaten earth floors and stone walls with cracks, they entered easily. Their sting was painful to adults and potentially lethal to small children. When Jesus says in Luke, "Or if he asks for an egg, we'll give him a scorpion," the juxtaposition is not random. Scorpions were there, inside the house, frequently found among domestic objects. The threat was everyday, not exotic. And there were snakes and spiders and rats, which in addition to attacking grain stocks, were vectors for disease. The house of earth and stone was permeable. There was no complete seal against the outside world. Insects entered through the cracks in the walls, through the edges of the roof, through the door, which was often just a curtain of animal skin or thick fabric. The night turned the house into a shared ecosystem. Humans, domestic animals, and wildlife occupying the same space in the darkness. And sleep. What was it like to sleep in this house? There were no beds in the sense we know, not for common families. The vast majority of people slept on the floor, on reed mats, animal skins, or wool blankets woven on the domestic loom. The most common bedding was the very cloak the person wore during the day. In the morning, it was clothing. At night, it was a blanket. Exodus 22, 26-27 legislates on this directly. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? The law forbade withholding someone's cloak as debt collateral during the night, because without it, the person would sleep exposed to the cold. This wasn't rhetoric, it was reality. People literally had a single piece of clothing that served for everything, and everyone slept together, in the same space, on the same floor. Parents, children, grandparents, daughters-in-law, all lined up side by side on the second level of the house, above the animals. The combined body heat was, in fact, part of the heating strategy during winter nights, when the temperature in the Judean mountains could drop to near freezing. Ecclesiastes captures exactly this. If two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And it is in this context that you need to reread Jesus' parable in Luke 11:5-8. the one about the friend who knocks at the door at midnight asking to borrow bread. The homeowner answers from within, "Do not bother me. The door is now shut and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything." We read this as laziness or irritation, but now you understand what was really at stake. The door was locked, likely barred with a wooden beam. Getting up meant navigating almost total darkness, stepping between the bodies of family members sleeping on the floor, trying not to wake children, stumbling between mats and blankets, going down to the lower level where the animals might be stirred, removing the door latch, and all this with the light of a lamp that barely illuminated a step ahead. It wasn't laziness, it was logistics. And the point of the parable, that the persistence of the request would eventually convince the owner to get up, gains a completely different dimension when you realize the real size of the sacrifice. And if the night inside a biblical house was already like this, the day was no less intense, because there is a sound that defined the morning of every morning in an Israelite village, and which today has completely disappeared from human experience. The sound of stone against stone, the sound of grinding. Every morning before dawn, the women rose to grind the grain for the day. Grinding was done with a pair of stones called rechaim, a fixed, wide, concave base stone and a smaller upper stone that was moved back and forth manually. The work was grueling. Studies of female skeletons from Iron Age sites show severe wear on knee joints, shoulders, and lumbar vertebrae, physical marks of years of grinding while kneeling on the floor. Premature arthritis, degeneration of spinal discs. Grinding literally deformed women's bodies over the years, and the flour produced was never completely pure. Microscopy of charred bread found in excavations reveals stone particles mixed with the flour, tiny fragments that broke off the grinding stones during the work. These particles, ingested daily over a lifetime, cause severe dental wear. Examinations of skulls from the period show teeth completely flattened, with the enamel destroyed, often down to the root. By age 40, if the person reached 40, chewing was an exercise in pain. And this leads us to an inevitable question. How long did people live in these houses? What was the life expectancy of those who inhabited these structures of stone and mud, ate this bread full of rock particles, drank this cistern water, and breathed this smoke? The demographic data is brutal. Based on osteological analysis of cemeteries like those at Lachish, Tel Arad, and Jerusalem, the average life expectancy at birth was 30 to 35 years. This does not mean everyone died at 30. High infant mortality pulls the average down violently. Those who survived childhood could reach 50 or 60, but was rare, and the old age that the Bible celebrates as a divine blessing, Abraham dying at 175, Moses at 120, was a theological statement, not a statistical one. In reality, a 55-year-old person in an Israelite village was genuinely elderly. Their body carried decades of heavy manual labor, periodic malnutrition, repeated infections, and exposure to the elements without adequate protection. When Proverbs speaks of grey hair as a crown of glory, Proverbs 16:31, it is because reaching grey hair was an achievement, not a cosmetic nuisance, a trophy of survival. And now that you have seen all this, I need you to do something. I need you to look around you, now. Wherever you are watching this video, look at the space around you and realize what you have. You have walls that don't let the wind in. Walls that don't need to be plastered every year so they don't collapse. You have a roof that won't cave in during the next heavy rain. You have windows, glass windows, which let the light in without letting the cold pass through. This alone would be considered magic in the biblical world. Transparent glass in windows. Impossible. Unthinkable. You have a button that produces instant light, not a lamp that barely illuminates 3 feet ahead and consumes the same oil that feeds your family. a switch that floods the entire room with white uniform light for hours at no perceptible cost. You have clean, treated water that comes out of a faucet. Water that has no larvae, no algae, no bacteria. Water that doesn't need to be carried in 30-pound jars on your head, climbing stone slopes 3 times a day. You have a refrigerator, an object that would make any ancient Israelite unable to understand what they were seeing. A piece of furniture that keeps food fresh for weeks. That eliminates the anxiety that defined the existence of every biblical family, the constant, inescapable, daily question: will we have food tomorrow? You never ask yourself that question. It doesn't even cross your mind. But for the people who built and inhabited the houses we saw today, that question was the first one upon waking and the last before sleeping. You have privacy. You have a room with a door. You have the possibility of being alone, a luxury that simply did not exist for 99% of the biblical population. You can close a door and be with yourself. They never could, and it is exactly here that archaeology does something that no other discipline can. It doesn't just show us what the past was like. It shows us what we are now, because when you understand, really understand in your gut, not just intellectually, the conditions in which your spiritual ancestors lived, read the scriptures, and found God, 2 things happen simultaneously. First, you realize that the faith of these people was forged in conditions that would make most of us give up. They didn't pray in a comfortable room with ambient music and soft lighting. They prayed kneeling on the beaten earth floor, in the darkness, with the smell of manure rising from the level below, with their bones aching from the day's work, not knowing if the food would last until the end of the month. And yet they prayed, and yet they trusted, and yet they wrote the Psalms. Their faith wasn't abstract. It was the most concrete thing they had, more concrete than the walls that could collapse, the roof that could sag, or the jars of grain that could run empty. The second thing that happens, you realize that the comfort in which we live is not normal. It is not the standard of human history. It is the exception. And if the people who lived in those 400 square foot houses, without light, without clean water, without privacy, without any guarantee that their children would survive childhood, if those people found a reason for gratitude, for praise, for hope, then what can be said of us? I'm not saying this to generate guilt. I'm saying it to generate perspective, because the next time you read the Bible and find someone entering a house, leaving a house, eating in a house, or praying in a house, now you know exactly where that person is. You know what they smell, what they hear, what they feel under their feet. You know the size of the space, the darkness of the corners, the heat of the tabun, the sound of the goats below. And this knowledge is not decorative. It transforms the text. It makes every verse an experience instead of information, because the Bible was not written in cathedrals. It was not thought out in climate-controlled libraries. It was not composed by people who lived as we live. It was written by people who lived exactly like this. Houses of stone and mud, with roofs that dripped, with earthen floors that kicked up dust with every step, with animals inside the house and entire families squeezed into a space that today we would consider unacceptable for a single person. And these people produced the most read, most translated, most influential book in the history of humanity, not despite the conditions in which they lived, from within them. And if this video changed the way you see the biblical world, I have a request. First, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell, because every week there's a new video here, and each one goes deeper into this ancient world that is so different and yet so connected to ours. Second, leave in the comments which detail impressed you the most. The darkness, the animals inside the house, infant mortality, the cloak that was clothing and blanket at the same time. I read all the comments and respond to as many as I can. And if this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.